epidemic proportions worldwide. And sort of tackling obesity is really a very complex issue because obesity is caused by many different variables, whether genetic, environmental, and other variables. But what has changed really over the last 20 to 30 years is our lifestyles. So we are eating more fast food, we are moving less, we are spending more time on our computers, on our smartphones, tablets, computer games, etc. So it's really the lifestyles that have changed over the last years. One of the main hypothesized causes of the continued increase in obesity is that the current preventative measures, they're individually targeted and they lack the proper understanding of obesity in the social context. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that there are actually preventative and intervention measures being undertaken. However, they focus on the individual and they ignore the social surrounding, they ignore the social context and the social networks of the individual. And that's why they have failed in reducing the obesity rates. What are social networks? What I mean by social networks here simply, they are the relationships and the ties that we have with people who are around us. And actually, researchers started to see the importance of social networks on our health, and they started investigating the effects of social networks on our health, and they did find that people around us actually do influence our health behaviors. What they also found is that closer people have actually more influence on our behavior than the general peers. So our friends, again, compared to our general peers, are more likely going to influence our behaviors. Another sort of more new and more sort of interesting and growing topic is the complexity and the structure of our social networks and how that can actually make us more vulnerable to certain obesity-related behaviors. So what some researchers have found that the structure of our social network and our friendship network, for instance, network size. So what they found was that network size was negatively associated with poor health outcomes. So people who have more friends compared to social isolates are more likely to have better health outcomes, for instance. Even our position in the network, so for example, the individual position, so things like individual popularity. So what they found, for instance, people who are more popular in the network, those who receive more friendship nominations, they are more likely to engage in risky health behaviors compared to other people who are less popular. Same applies for our centrality. So individuals who have a more central position in the network are actually found to be highly influential compared to other people who are less central. So it is actually very important to look at not just the influence of friends on our behavior, but also the structure of our networks and how that could influence our behaviors. So what I did is I went to the literature and I did a systemized literature review. A systemized literature review is like a mini systematic literature review, really. And I used sort of some keywords, and sometimes I had to use some combination of keywords. And I limited my search for age group 18 and below. So I was looking for adolescents and I was looking for children. And the reason why I limited my search for 18 and below is because compared to adults, adolescents and children are actually more vulnerable to friend influence and peer influence. And what I found actually were 14 studies that met the inclusion criteria. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but I'll just give you the important points. The majority of the studies were used quantitative methods. A majority also were on adolescents, and geographical locations were mainly in the States, in Canada, Europe, UK, Australia, and of course none of the studies were being done in the MENA region. So if you look at the literature, you'll find that there were 3 obesity-related behaviors that were investigated in this context. Focus has been mainly on diet and physical activity, less focus on sedentary behaviors, but there's still studies on that. And for friendship networks, I noticed there were two themes. So the first theme, or the first sort of kind of studies, were looking at associations between the individual behavior and the behavior of their friends. So they were looking for similarities in behaviors among friends in the obesity-related behaviors. The other types of studies, and these are the more recent ones, they were looking at association between individual behavior and between the characteristics or the properties of the friendship networks. So what's the literature standing, for instance, on diet in friendship networks? So there seems to be evidence in the literature on similarities between friends and their dietary behavior, specifically for fast food. There are, however, some researchers who argued that there isn't much similarity when it comes to adolescents and their diet, and that the diet is mainly influenced by their parents. Also, another interesting finding was that individual popularity, so receiving friendship nominations, was found to be positively associated with consumption of unhealthy snacks. So kids who were sort of more popular were more likely to eat like calorie-dense or unhealthy snacks. When it comes to physical activity, there's actually like 100% like consensus in the literature on the effect of friends' physical activity on the individual's physical activity levels. And what they found that also the more physically active friends you have, the more likely you're going to be physically active. And another interesting finding was the size of the friendship network. So the bigger the size of your friendship network, again, the more likely you're going to be physically active compared to like a social isolate. And when it comes to sedentary behavior, which as I mentioned, there was less research done in the literature on sedentary behavior, but it was still there. And the evidence was actually kind of mixed and inconsistent between the genders. There were a few researchers that said that there was a similarity between friends and sedentary behavior, but some were saying no. So, but an interesting finding was that network density was associated with sedentary behavior. So like kids in like more dense networks were more likely to be sedentary, so they were playing with their computers, their iPads, or video games, etc. So this table sort of just summarizes the findings from the literature. And as you see, there is 3 obesity-related behaviors: diet, physical activity, sedentary behavior. And there were basically like 2 themes in the literature. The first was similarity in friends' behaviors, and there was evidence for all behaviors. And the other was the associations between the network properties and between the obesity-related behaviors. So really, the literature suggests that friendships are an important context for the spread and maintenance of obesity-related behaviors, and there are strong associations between friends and peers in their obesity-related behaviors. But why is this very important? Well, actually, this is important because when we're designing and we're implementing sort of interventions, there needs to be a focus on the network, and this is what they call in the literature as network-based intervention, compared to the classic sort of individual intervention where they just focus on the individual and then they try to have the individual like be more physically active or lose weight, etc. And that obviously hasn't worked because obesity just keeps increasing. So there needs to be sort of a design and implementation of network-based interventions. So in conclusion, although friendship networks have been linked to obesity-related behaviors, the network characteristics have not been broadly examined. Additionally, sleep deprivation, an important predictor of obesity, has been completely neglected in the literature, so that needs to also be studied in the context. And of course, as I said, results from this review are informative for designing effective interventions. As for recommendations for future research from the review, so what the researchers are calling for are future studies in different sort of cultural contexts and different clinical samples, and also future studies to investigate whether or not friendship influence obesity via other pathways, not just diet and physical activity, which has been the main focus. So as I mentioned, for instance, maybe sleep. And further investigation of the type of the association between the networks and some of the obesity-related behaviors is also important to advance our knowledge of the mechanisms of these behavior and to inform evidence health-based policy. So that's it for me. If you have, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask.
Okay, thank you, Noor. Anyone have a question? No? So can I ask you?
Yeah, of course. You can ask.
I've got a question. So, are you very interesting, by the way? That was quite interesting. Are you saying? I'll bring it down to me. I'm guilty of this. Are you saying that if I was a teenager, to make me stop eating junk food, the doctor should tell my friends to stop eating junk food, not me? Is that your finding?
Well, it's not. The doctor won't be able to tell everybody's friends to stop eating junk food, but basically what has been happening is that the current, again, prevention measures, they haven't been working because they have been just focused on the individual. But there is great potential for network-based interventions. So, for example, if we look at, for instance, individual, centrality and there's an association between being central and being able to influence more people. So maybe when there is a policy to target, people to be more physically active, they can maybe target the more central people in the network, and then that will have sort of a better sort of effect than just targeting random people, for example, in the network. So that's one example.
Okay, so the epigenetic effect of obesity is relationship-based rather than relationship and behaviors rather than in your DNA.
Well, it is in your DNA, of course. There's multiple genetic factors, but that has not changed over the last 20, 30 years. As well as, of course, yeah. What has changed really is our lifestyles, and back in 2007, there was a groundbreaking study that said, obesity was spreading in social networks. And a big gap in the literature is the mechanisms of that spread and how that spread actually happens. One of the potential or one of the ideas is that obesity spreads through obesity behaviors. So through the diet, through the physical activity, etc., especially among adolescents. Yes, you do.
See, there's a tiny bit of a risk in this, isn't there? If you're saying that obesity is spread through these networks, in one sense, what you're almost sort of suggesting is that what you're looking at here are networks of people who get together because they are obese.
Well, this is something.
So one aspect, because I don't understand what your causal set of relationships are here, and that's the problem. And there's a second question: isn't there a little bit of an ethical issue here about the way you're talking about networks, and that what you're almost suggesting is a form of kind of rationalized state bullying of people?
Okay, well, to answer your first question, which was about whether sort of we select, we're obese, for example, our friends are obese because we select, let's refer to as social selection, and then there's social influence, which we actually influence them to become obese. And then there's a third issue, which is the environment. This is actually a problem referred to in the literature as the reflection problem. And many researchers look into that. Is it the environment? Is it the influence? Or is it the social selection or homophily? That's what they call it. And there is evidence for all. There is evidence for environment, and there is evidence for social selection, and there's also evidence for influence. So it's not just that, I happen to be, I don't hang around people who are, for example, not working out because I chose them based on that. It might be that, but it's also because we influence each other, and sort of the behavior spreads and stays in the network.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's for the first question. The second question was about the ethical sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some quite big problems about the ethics of this. I mean, this is almost at the point of cyberbullying, where someone says, I'm thin, and therefore, if you want to be one of my friends, you've got to be thin too.
It's actually not necessarily. If we're looking at it, it's not just the obesity. So we're not just looking in the study. I'm not just, when I go to actually get the data, it's not that just obese children or obese adolescents. It's actually the lifestyles. So people, you might not be physically active, but you might be thin. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a healthy thing. So we're looking at the lifestyles more so of the obesity itself. So again, I don't want to sound like I'm like socially marginalizing but it's the lifestyle behavior more really than just obesity or like your weight or your BMI or such that. So we're trying to because kids these days, they're also lazier. They're not working out as much as they used to, or they're not active as much as they used to because of all the tablets and the technology. So we want kids, even if they were thin, even if they had a healthy BMI, but we want them to be more physically active. Kids are eating more, fast food, and we don't want that. So it's not necessarily just the obesity, it's also the behaviors. We want to sort of enhance the lifestyles of these adolescents. That's the main goal, really.
Thank you. Dr. Saeed, yes?
Regarding the age, Noor, thank you very much for your presentation. But I want to ask you about the age.
Yeah.
I think 18 and blue.
Hmm.
I think it is a wide range of age. Why? Because you have to select from 5 or 6 to 9 years, or 10 to 18. Why? Because there is a hormonal changes. These hormonal changes may affect or as a predisposing factor for obesity. So I think you have to select one of them. But 18 or blue, it is a wide range of age.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. And that's why for my actual data collection, I'm only going to use 11 to 19 or 11 to 18. And these are adolescents. And even within the adolescents, there is late adolescents and there is early adolescents. So yes, this will definitely be taken into account. But definitely this is just sort of the literature review, but definitely for the actual field study, definitely will be doing adolescents, like 11 to 18. Thank you.
Anyone else? Do you agree? Another? Yes, Talal, yes.
Okay, I think the answer to some of these questions in terms of what is the causes of what in terms of obesity, if you look at Bahrain, Qatar, they're in the top 10 of obese nations in the world. If you look at the UK and US, where they have actually studied the epidemic of obesity in the early 90s, that obesity is still rising despite the sugar taxes, despite the government and the public policy planning of open spaces and exercises. So uh, it's almost like a storm coming and people trying to put trenches, but it's not working. So what is being talked about now is that obesity cannot really be looked at in the traditional regression model where there is a y and there's x's that is actually influencing it. It's actually a combination of different dependent and independent factors that are actually becoming dependent and independent on ad hoc basis. That's why it's very difficult to pinpoint. But my question for Noor is that I just felt you said you systemized literature review. That is a mini systematic literature review, but I felt it's just too small because there are two main references that actually been shown all of the times when you're talking about the different factors. There is the Delahaye and the other one Ali and something, Ali et al. These two references have been there in all of the factors. So if you look at these papers and you look at their factors, you will see that they actually use combination of different or a variety of references. So the fact that you rely on two references for coming up with a set of factors for the very complex issue, I find that it a little bit weak.
Okay. Well, actually, Delahaye has like 4 publications, so, and it's a very sort of narrow, it's a very narrow topic, and it's also, you could see, fairly new. Like, they only started talking about the behaviors as a mean of a spread of obesity following 2010, 2011. And they only started talking about the network variables, I'd say 2014 and, afterwards. So there is very limited research. And as I said, I found 14 studies only on that. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I would fundamentally argue obesity is a healthcare problem. Why would your research add to some knowledge which is largely related to healthcare management? And who would believe your research?
I'm hoping that, what I'll do towards the end is provide some recommendations for policymakers. And if they believe it, then good. If they don't, there's nothing I can do.
Can I give some who might be interested, who would care? World Health Organization,
Yeah.
World Food Program, the NHS, Bahrain Ministry of Health, the GCC Health what's it called, Council,
Yes.
and people who have interest in food. So I think a lot of people might care. And parents.
May I add a comment? Yes, because I'm a healthcare provider. I'm an associate professor of physiotherapy. So all over the time when we're dealing with obese patients, we are only concerned with the physical agents, like diet, physical exercise. As mentioned by Noor in the early presentation, the early part of the presentation, that we ignore all over the time this social part. We are concerned with the physical. But all over the time, we have challenge that the patients are not losing weight or losing for a while and come back for the gaining weight. So it's a very important perspective to look at. As you know, obesity is multifactorial. We cannot catch it from all sides, but merging all these perspectives is a challenge. We are trying to decrease the rate, the epidemic that is invading the world wide in every nation. So this may be an addition. Yes, Doctor?
You spoke about sleep deprivation.
Yes.
Are you considering other factors, yani stress, for example? Although they might be less physically active, but a lot of kids are physically active. They have a lot of pressure from the Kardashians and so on, and to how a body should look like. No, seriously, and
The media
I
sorts
see
of
kids and the media and the body image and so on. All the kids are concerned more than we ever were. I grew up thinner than, I didn't have problems that my kids have, boys or girls. They are thinking all the time, but they have more stress, from peers. They have more stress at school. They have more homework, more activity, more this, more that. It's stressing them more. Their sleep quality is not good. They have sleep deprivation. So I think in your lifestyle, I'm not sure what factors are you taking. But
I haven't looked
my
at
question
stress,
is, are you considering all of these?
Well, I'm not actually considering, but that's a very good point because stress is actually, has been found to be correlated with obesity. But yeah, thank you for the intervention. Maybe I'll look into it for the future. Thank you.
Anyone else? I think this is the end for you, Noor. Thank you for your
Thank you very
presentation.
much. Thank you.